In 1812, French Emperor Napoleon Bonaparte invaded Russia. But in the process, he lost his army and ultimately his empire. Over a century later, Hitler's Nazi soldiers met the same fate. But these armies were not defeated by the Russian troops that came to fight. The merciless enemy was the Russian winter. Around the world and throughout time, weather has played a part in the fortunes of mankind. Violent events in our planet's atmosphere have transformed history. These are the stories of weather that changed the world. Northern Europe, 2002. Construction workers unearth a sinister mystery. A mass grave of over 3,000 skeletons. Clues in the sand reveal these are the remains of some of Napoleon's French army, one of the greatest fighting forces in history. But this French grave isn't in France. It's over 1,000 miles away in Vilnius, Lithuania. Why are so many of Napoleon's men buried here, so far from home? Historian Ben Townsend believes the key to the mystery is the cold Russian winter of 1812.
In 1812, Napoleon's at the height of his power. Almost all of continental Europe is under his control. Just Russia remains, so he assembles an army to invade.
Over 500,000 men and 175,000 horses prepare to enter Russia. At the time, it was the largest military force ever assembled.
Napoleon felt invincible. After all, what could go wrong? He had made every preparation. The French army were the best in the world at this time. They also outnumbered the Russian field army by a factor of 3 to 1.
Napoleon and his grand army set off. By June 24th, they reach Europe's eastern edge and cross the river Niemen into Russia. Only 1 in every 22 soldiers will return.
Napoleon plans to crush the Russian army close to the border and force them to make peace on his terms.
But instead, the Russian army retreat. Napoleon follows, leading his men across the vast plains, deeper and deeper into the Russian interior. The ruthless Russian winter is still far off, but a different type of extreme weather begins to take its toll.
Well, Russia has a climate of extreme temperature variability, and certainly Napoleon's soldiers would have had to struggle to cope with that. In the summertime, temperatures can exceed 100 degrees Fahrenheit, but in the winter, they can be 90 degrees below zero. Very similar to what we see in the American plains, places like Nebraska and Kansas, and the reason for both is the same. Both locations, hundreds of miles away from the nearest ocean.
Oceans, like the Atlantic, take much longer to store and release heat than the land. They act like a heat sink. This regulates temperatures and keeps the climate of coastal landmasses mild. But in the heart of Russia, thousands of miles from the sea, seasonal temperatures are extreme. Soaring summer heat exhausts the invading French army and kills thousands of horses, making it hard to move artillery and supplies. The retreating enemy make conditions even worse.
The Russian army leaves a trail of devastation behind it. They burn everything, making it almost impossible for Napoleon to feed and supply his army.
Finally, on September 14th, 1812, Napoleon's army reached the Russian capital, Moscow. After chasing the Russians for 3 long months, Napoleon feels confident they will finally beg for peace. But instead of surrendering, the Russian army torched their own city, determined to deny Napoleon any resources.
Napoleon lingers in Moscow for 35 days, waiting for the Russians to open negotiations, but they are silent. In the meantime, time is passing, and the fabled Russian winter's approaching.
Napoleon's army have traveled 1,500 miles from home and don't know what's about to hit them.
While Napoleon's men were waiting it out in Moscow, they didn't realize that winter had already started in Siberia. Siberia is to Russia what northern Canada is to the United States. It's where cold air is refrigerated, one of the coldest places in the whole northern hemisphere. And as a winter high pressure builds in and sinking air seeps across the country, it delivers that cold air westward.
As this tidal wave of freezing air moves west towards Moscow, Russia becomes enveloped in an icy blanket of cold.
This is what the Russian winter looks like. While Napoleon lingered in Moscow, he had no idea of the role this weather was going to play in his downfall.
After weeks of looting the treasure of Moscow, Napoleon finally orders the retreat on October 18th. The French army set off for home, but they don't realize they're marching straight into the jaws of winter.
Winter causes all sorts of problems in this day and age. For example, an inch of rain is actually equivalent to 10 inches of snow. And in Russia, we can expect many feet of snow in a typical winter. So think about the Napoleonic army marching 800 miles during the course of the winter through that snow, never being used to it. It must have been an absolute nightmare for them.
The temperature drops to 40 below zero. Men's breath turns to ice as it leaves their lips. Rivers and lakes freeze several feet thick. To find out what Russia's winter would have felt like, meteorologist Thomas Schaffernacker and historian Ben Townsend team up for an experiment.
Well, we're in a climate chamber where currently the temperature is minus 32 degrees Fahrenheit, incredibly cold. We've got the power to basically recreate the winter conditions of 1812. I've got some hot water here, and I'm going to pour it into the Petri dish and see just how quickly the water's going to freeze in these incredibly cold conditions. Well, 10 minutes later, and the water's just started to freeze. You can clearly see the ice here. Now, that's obviously really bad news for Napoleon's soldiers and for their water supply. But we'll get Ben in here and see how it actually felt for the soldiers themselves. Come on, Ben.
Ben's wearing a uniform that's a replica of that worn by Napoleon's soldiers.
It's cold. Yeah, very cold.
It's a smart outfit, but not designed for 66 below freezing.
I'm really feeling it at this point. Already on the extremities, and my stomach's cold already.
Yeah. There's not many layers there, is there?
Just a shirt and a little piece of wool in between me and 37 degrees of frost.
Ben can stand no more than 10 minutes in these conditions. But Napoleon's men face this level of extreme cold for weeks on end. The soldiers took desperate measures to try to keep warm. Anything was worn as a barrier against the cold, from fur off horse saddles to fine silks and dresses, all stolen from Moscow. One French colonel wrote,
"One could see all the provisions and loot of Moscow being gradually brought out. It was a hilarious sight to see these tanned faces, these moustaches, these fearsome men enveloped in the most tender clothes."
2 weeks' march from Moscow, and the French army are still more than 1,000 miles from home. And just as they thought the severe cold couldn't get any worse, the Russian winter deals its deadliest blow. November 6, 1812. Napoleon's army have invaded Russia, but failed to crush the Russian army. Now, as they retreat back to France, they're engulfed by the Russian winter. The cold is almost unbearable, but now they face an even greater threat: the deathly chill of Russia's Arctic winds. To find out just what that felt like, historian Ben Townsend and meteorologist Thomas Schaffernacker are in a cold chamber set at minus 32 degrees.
I'm wearing a replica Napoleonic uniform, and in Napoleon's time, they didn't fight during the winter. You can see it's not designed for these conditions.
Well, you're obviously shivering, but it's going to get a lot colder because we're going to switch this fan on and see how you cope with the effects of wind chill.
Earlier, Thomas found that a dish of hot water took just 10 minutes to freeze at this temperature.
I'm going to pour some more hot water in the Petri dish, put it next to you where the fan is, and see how long it takes for the water to freeze this time.
this experiment will replicate the Arctic winds Napoleon's soldiers would have endured.
It's cold. It's severely cold now. In fact, I'm not sure how they can stand this for very long. I'm freezing. Especially the flimsiness here. And I can feel my legs are starting to go as well. The wind chill makes all of the difference. This uniform has no windproofing at all.
Ben's exposed face is now at risk of frostbite in just 5 minutes. Meanwhile, the hot water freezes twice as fast as it did in still air.
Well, Ben, look, the water's completely frozen. The wind was whipping away the heat from the surface of the water, very much like the wind was stripping away that layer of heat around your body all the time. And that's wind chill. That's why you got cold so quickly. The air coming out of the fan is probably blowing at around 30 miles an hour, but some of the soldiers could have experienced winds of 50 miles an hour.
It's a miracle any of them survived.
Extreme temperatures also affect gear and supplies.
Imagine trying to fight in this. Water and food freeze solid, and it's hard to fight when your fingers will freeze to the barrel of your gun.
The Russians lived and trained in this inhospitable climate, while the French couldn't be less prepared.
There was no quarters and no barns to sleep in. Napoleon's men were literally bedding down in the snow, wrapped in a blanket if they were lucky. This is when exposure bites.
By early December, hypothermia is killing off Napoleon's soldiers in the thousands. As the men's body temperature drops lower and lower, they become delusional and disoriented. Finally, they are overcome with an uncontrollable urge to sleep. But in these conditions, they will never wake up.
A colonel of Napoleon's army describes passing 900 men frozen to death by the side of the road.
It wasn't just Napoleon's men that were unprepared for the Russian winter. So were his horses. And the effects of what followed would cost him not only this mission, but his entire empire. December 1812. After failing to beat the Russian army, Napoleon and his men are marching back to Europe through Russia's brutal winter weather. In the month since leaving Moscow, 50,000 men have died. And it's not just the men Napoleon has to worry about.
Napoleon was amply supplied with horses, and yet he lost more than 100,000 in Russia. This monstrous expenditure of horseflesh was owing to one remarkably small miscalculation.
His horses were wearing the wrong horseshoes. Historians believe this tiny detail played a major role in the army's demise. Farriers like Bernie Tidmarsh still make horseshoes in much the same way as in Napoleon's time.
Afternoon, Bernie.
Afternoon, Ben.
This is one of the shoes that Napoleon's cavalry wore on the retreat. Can you tell me how this would perform in winter conditions?
This is too flat, literally no grip at all to that. It was a summer shoe. They'd just slip and slide all over the place. We would have fitted a shoe with some grips. That's the winter shoe, so that would actually bite into the snow and the ice.
What would be the consequences of not fitting this sort of shoe?
Well, horses falling over, broken legs, just devastation, really.
By mid-December, nearly all Napoleon's horses are dead. Without the cavalry, it becomes virtually impossible to move the guns. Defenseless, the army now faces a new enemy.
One cry was guaranteed to strike fear into the retreating French troops, that the Cossacks were coming.
Seeing the weak, powerless army, Cossack tribesmen seized the opportunity to attack and rob. The loss of horses also means the loss of the food wagons they carry. Starvation begins to take hold. Men cut the frozen flesh from dead horses and gnaw on leather in a bid for nourishment. Some even eat gunpowder to gain much-needed salt. 5 weeks after leaving Moscow, only 1 in 5 soldiers is still alive. Napoleon is determined not to let news of the disaster reach Paris before him and abandons his remaining men. Now, their only hope is to reach the nearest town.
I'm in Vilnius, Lithuania. This was the town where Napoleon's men hoped to find a refuge from the frozen hell of the retreat. However, when they were within 6 miles of the town, the weather played one last trick on them.
As the sanctuary of Vilnius approaches, the temperature drops to a new record low, 66 degrees below freezing.
The nail in the coffin for Napoleon's army was the fact that the winter of 1812 was exceptionally cold. It was much colder than it normally would have been.
Even for those who made it to Vilnius, the horrors of Russian winter weren't over. Unable to cope with the influx of 20,000 desperate men, the small town closed its doors. Exhausted, some soldiers curled up in a doorway and went to sleep. They would lie buried in Vilnius for nearly 200 years. Eventually to be discovered piled together in a mass grave. Forensic anthropologist Dr. Rimantas Jankauskas has been examining the skeletons.
We found no battle wounds on the bones of these soldiers, so that was indication that they died not in combat. So the question for us was, what were the causes of their deaths? Why did they die?
The clue was in the position some of the skeletons were found.
Some of the bodies in mass grave were found in embryo position, and this position the people are usually occupying when they're freezing to preserve heat. And this corresponds well with all historical sources that they were freezing in streets and dying immediately.
Rimantas estimates another 20,000 French soldiers lie buried beneath Vilnius.
Of the 400,000 men that Napoleon took into Russia, less than 20,000 made it back across the bridges and through the ice. It was the biggest military disaster of all time. Napoleon had lost an army, and the French Empire was now doomed.
By 1815, Napoleon had rallied another army of men, but he was still short of horses.
Napoleon's cavalry never recovered from their enormous loss of horses in Russia. This was to prove a deciding factor in his final defeat at Waterloo.
Napoleon had misjudged the Russian weather with devastating consequences. But 130 years later, could one man with an even bigger army finally beat the Russian winter? In 1941, World War II rages. Just like Napoleon before him, Hitler invades Russia with more men and machinery than ever before. But war has changed since Napoleon's invasion. Tanks and trucks have replaced horses and are far more resilient in bad weather.
Hitler had total faith in his technological advantage over the Russians. He willfully ignored the role that weather had played in Napoleon's retreat and would not even discuss Napoleon's winter defeat with his advisors.
In June 1941, 3 million men crossed the Russian border along a 2,000-mile front. Like Napoleon, Hitler is confident of a swift defeat. But also like Napoleon, his men are dressed in thin summer uniforms.
Initially, Hitler's troops were very successful, but then the weather turned against them. A series of autumn rainstorms turned all the roads basically into a big, muddy mess, and the soldiers got stuck where they stood. And as they tried to struggle on, well, the Russian winter descended.
The temperature drops to minus 63 degrees Fahrenheit. Its effect on the men is devastating.
And they were still wearing their summer uniforms. They began freezing to death, and quickly, coats from the victims of Auschwitz were shipped to the Eastern Front to stop them from freezing.
But the cold also renders their equipment useless.
Technology was the thing that Hitler used to distance himself from Napoleon's disaster. The German weapons were very sophisticated, but when the temperature fell, they just stopped working. Russian weapons, with their simpler design, kept going.
Rifle firing pins snap off. Machine guns seize up. And just as Napoleon lost his horses, the Nazis now lose their transport as tanks and trucks stick fast in the snow. History literally repeats itself.
After 3 long, cold years of fighting, the German army batters itself to pieces on the ruins of Stalingrad. The myth of the invincible German army was destroyed.
25 million people died on or near the battlefields in Russia, leaving the German army too broken and exhausted to effectively defend their empire.
Once again, the Russian winter had destroyed the greatest fighting force of its time. For Hitler, just as it was for Napoleon, this was the beginning of the end.
The war finally ended in 1945, and for the second time in 2 centuries, the Russian climate had obliterated a mighty army.
The lesson from history is you may have the biggest army, you may have the best army, but if you ignore the weather, it will be your downfall.
Time and again, the forces of nature have crushed the wills of man and changed history.